do you calculate 200 years plus of brutality and murder and violence and the destruction of family and the lack of transfer of wealth? How do you calculate that? How do you calculate that for the descendants of enslaved Africans?
Conversations about the damages caused by the enslavement of Black people and the discriminatory and racist policies that came after emancipation are not new. But as the US continues to reckon with racial injustice, there's a renewed push to figure out how reparations can become a reality.
I think we're at a moment when the nation knows it cannot continue any longer without addressing the original sin, not my neighbor, not my fellow Texan, but the United States government that sanctioned this horrific act and continued disparities against the descendants of enslaved Africans, Black Americans, African Americans, from redlining to denial of loans.
This is Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. She's served as the representative for Texas's 18th district since 1995. Congresswoman Jackson Lee is the main sponsor of a bill which is meant to address reparations on a national scale. It's called H.R. 40.
What it says is that we will establish this, appointed by the leaders of the House and Senate and the President of the United States, and we will provide a vast opportunity for data collection and witnesses and testimony and going around the nation and finding out, how do you address this question?
Basically, the bill establishes a commission that would create national reparations proposals that focus on which African Americans should be paid and how. The creators of the bill say it's the first of its kind to address slavery directly at a national level.
Some communities are saying, well, we want to pay reparations, so here's a jobs bill. Well, no, that's maybe good public policy, maybe necessary, maybe important, but it's not reparations.
That's Dr. Ron Daniels. He's the president and founder of the Institute of the Black World 21st Century and the convener of the National African American Reparations Commission. He's been part of the fight to pass H.R. 40 for decades.
H.R. 40 strikes at the heart, the essence of structural institutional racism in these United States of America.
But critics of the bill have often taken issue with the perceived costs and what they say is a complicated process.
Putting aside the injustice of monetary reparations from current taxpayers for the sins of a small subset of Americans from many generations ago, let me finish. The fair distribution of reparations would be nearly impossible once one considers the complexity of the American struggle to abolish slavery.
I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us currently living are responsible, is a good idea. We've tried to deal with our original sin of slavery by fighting a civil war, by passing landmark civil rights legislation. We've elected an African-American president.
But remember, this bill for reparations isn't just about what took place during slavery. It's also about the racially discriminatory and exclusionary policies that took place after emancipation.
We have to get people to understand what we're talking about. It's not an indictment of individuals, even though we obviously have some people who are individually hateful and prejudiced and racist in their behavior, but we're talking about much more than that. We're talking about something bigger than that, in terms of having people understand that we are where we are today in this country because of this historical tragedy that occurred.
But despite the critics, Jackson Lee says support for the bill has begun to increase. When it was first introduced in 1989, the bill garnered 24 co-sponsors. As of October 2020, the bill currently has 157. All of the co-sponsors are within the Democratic Party.
I believe this moment in history where the racial divide is being stoked and more people are throwing gasoline on fire, I think we all are trying to find a way where we can link arms and have Congress in some way be part of the solution.
And certainly the lynching, the public lynching of George Floyd, and the pandemic of racialized murders by state-sponsored actors. I mean, it has birthed this huge movement under the auspices of Black Lives Matter.
But it wasn't always like that. Reparations is a centuries-old movement in the US. In fact, H.R. 40 draws its name from the very first form of reparations for slavery in the U.S., which was introduced in January of 1865, before the Civil War even ended.
It was the idea from General Sherman to take 400,000 acres and to divide it with 40 acres and a mule. And for people to understand, that was money, that was wealth, that was giving 40 acres and mobility. A mule was mobility. And that was, in essence, to say we were at fault, this was heinous, this was horrible, this was brutal, and this is a response to that.
But the order was stopped when Andrew Johnson took office after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. Rather than grant the 40 acres and a mule, Johnson gave the land back to its former Confederate owners. And formerly enslaved people were never given their payments. Over a century went by, and in 1989, Congressman John Conyers introduced the first version of H.R. 40 to Congress. Keep in mind that this was just a year after Japanese Americans were granted reparations for being forced into internment camps during World War II.
You're always going to hear members of Congress tell you we can't afford it, that the time isn't right, that there are 1,000 reasons why this should not be done right now.
That's John Tateishi. He was at the forefront of the fight for Japanese American reparations.
I mean, everyone told me that this is doomed to failure. Don't do it. And it's an impossibility. And it was. I mean, I knew that it was an impossibility because no one had ever done this, not at this scale. And so I knew trying to achieve this was going to be an impossible challenge. But, you know, my feeling was, well, we'll take it as far as we can.
Tateishi says he and Conyers discussed reparations for slavery during H.R. 40's creation, and says Conyers initially intended for the bill to address the lost reparations of 1865. But support for reparations for the brutality of enslaving Africans in the U.S. was small in the late 1980s. So instead, the bill served as an introduction to the topic.
As a member of the Judiciary Committee, the first African American on the House Judiciary Committee in its history, it became very clear that as we struggle with the questions of civil rights, affirmative action, equality of opportunity, there must be some historical cognition on our part about the whole question of reparations.
In the meantime, several people across the country took to suing the national government for reparations, with mixed levels of success. And Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush acknowledged the atrocities of slavery in statements that received mixed responses across the country. On June 18, 2009, the 111th Congress issued a statement apologizing for the impacts of the institution of slavery and Jim Crow-era laws on Black communities in the U.S. And in 2017, H.R. 40 transitioned from a study of if reparations should happen to one of how it could happen. 2 years later, on June 19, 2019, the bill was brought for its first hearing in Congress in 12 years.
In H.R. 40, this body has a chance to both make good on its 2009 apology for enslavement and reject fair-weather patriotism, to say that a nation is both its credits and its debits, that if Thomas Jefferson matters, so does Sally Hemings, that if D-Day matters, so does Black Wall Street, that if Valley Forge matters, so does Fort Pillow. Because the question really is not whether we will be tied to the somethings of our past, but whether we are courageous enough to be tied to the whole of them. Thank you.
The bill has never reached a vote in the House of Representatives. But as protests for racial justice have taken hold across the U.S., so has a renewed focus on the bill. Even with recently renewed support for the bill in Congress, both Jackson Lee and Daniels say it's unlikely to pass without more public support.
Gen Z and millennials have been motivating forces in saying why we can't wait. And so I thought if we could do this in a sense of healing racial divide, now more than any moment in history, I believe it is appropriate. But I've always taken it seriously. I've always sought for my colleagues to take it seriously. And I've always gone to those who don't look like me, not in anger or anguish, but in a way of saying, you want to do this because America is better than this.